10 parts, each of which turned its section of the front into a personal meat grinder for the enemy. 10 stories about the price at which some units knocked out the enemy's manpower, while others simply ceased to exist in the process. The 13th Guards Rifle Division of Rodimtsev ferried across the Volga under a barrage of fire on the night of the 15th of September, 1942, lost up to a third of its personnel right on the landing stages within the first 24 hours of fighting, and still held the city center. Its soldiers held the railway station, Mamayev Kurgan, and the famous house of Sergeant Pavlov, which the German side noted in its staff reports as a separate fortified area, not a residential building, as if it were a veritable fortress with a garrison and artillery support. A little-known detail: a significant portion of the division's reinforcements consisted of untrained recruits who were thrown into battle literally on the march, sometimes without personal weapons for each man, with the verbal order to pick up a rifle from a fallen comrade right at the crossing. According to German reports, for the street fighting in the area of the railway station and the Kurgan, the Wehrmacht lost more personnel here than during the entire French campaign of 1940, although the area of combat did not exceed several city blocks. German artillery and aviation continuously churned up the division's positions, and shells sometimes fell so densely that for weeks the soldiers could not raise their heads from the trenches even at night, and communication between individual groups was maintained literally by messengers crawling through the destroyed blocks. The average lifespan of an untested recruit on the division's forward positions during those weeks, according to later calculations by veterans and historians, was measured not in weeks but in mere days of fighting in the rubble and basements. Out of approximately 10,000 men ferried to the Western Bank in September, by the end of the Battle of Stalingrad, only a few hundred veterans of the original formation remained in the ranks, and the division itself was essentially renewed by reinforcements over the months of fighting, retaining from its original composition perhaps only its number and its battle flag. The Grossdeutschland Division, formerly considered an elite infantry and later Panzer Grenadier Division of the Wehrmacht, was staffed exclusively by selected volunteers from across Germany and de facto served as the fire brigade of the Eastern Front. It was deployed wherever a collapse threatened an entire army group. By the way, we've just realized our audience is growing, and we don't even know the geography of our viewers. Write right now in the comments which city or country you are from. We are incredibly interested to read, and we'll also see where we are being watched from most often. Thank you. So, it was this very division that the German command repeatedly used to plug gaps near Kursk, Smolensk, and later in East Prussia. And precisely for this reason, its personnel losses during the war are estimated by historians as among the highest for German formations of comparable size. According to various estimates, the division almost completely renewed its personnel several times over just a few months of fighting. A non-obvious fact: the soldiers of Grossdeutschland received enhanced rations, better weaponry, and even their own propaganda privileges compared to regular infantry. But it was precisely their elite status that doomed them to constant use in counterattacks against Soviet breakthroughs, where the chances of survival sharply dropped compared to defending on quiet sectors. Some division veterans later recalled that a transfer to Grossdeutschland was perceived by soldiers simultaneously as an honor and as an almost guaranteed ticket to the front lines until the war's end. The division fought until the final days of the war and capitulated in May 1945 in East Prussia, having lost, according to German data, just in 1944 alone, more personnel than it had at the beginning of that year. The SS Death's Head Tank Division, which grew out of concentration camp guard units, earned a reputation as perhaps the most aggressive formation on the Eastern Front. The High Command deployed it where maneuvering was not required, but rather simply breaking through the enemy's defenses at any cost, regardless of losses. It was this division that held the so-called Demyansk Pocket in encirclement for almost a year, effectively breaking the siege with virtually no external support, and suffered losses there that German staff reports acknowledged as catastrophic, even for a formation of its size. A little-known fact: despite the elite status of the SS troops, a significant portion of the division's equipment near Demyansk was supplied not through army channels, but by transport aircraft, and it often fought with captured Soviet weapons and ammunition due to constant disruptions in aerial supply. Part of the division's personnel simply froze to death in the pocket during winter without warm clothing, as the Wehrmacht's quartermaster services had not anticipated such a prolonged blockade, and field hospitals inside the pocket quickly overflowed with frostbite victims and wounded soldiers who had nowhere to be placed. The veterans of the division who survived Demyansk were subsequently regarded within the Wehrmacht as a kind of elite within the elite, people who had survived what official propaganda openly called an impossible-to-survive encirclement. Later, the division participated in the tank battle near Prokhorovka and in the heaviest defensive battles in Hungary during the winter of 1945, where its losses were again assessed as among the highest among SS tank formations on the entire front. By the end of the war, according to historical estimates, only a few percent of the division's original personnel remained in service. The majority had been killed, gone missing, or been discharged due to wounds on the Eastern Front. The 316th Rifle Division, under the command of General Panfilov, was formed in the autumn of 1941, primarily from conscripts of Kazakhstan and Central Asia, many of whom had never held a weapon before and did not always speak Russian fluently. It was this division that bore one of the main tank assaults of the Wehrmacht in the Volokholamsk direction during the days when the fate of Moscow was being decided, and at the cost of enormous losses, delayed the enemy's advance for a critically important 24 hours before the arrival of reserves. A non-obvious detail: the exact number of soldiers and the precise circumstances of the division's most famous episode, the Battle of a Company at the Dubosikovo siding, remained a subject of debate among historians for decades, and some of the heroic details, widely circulated by the press during the war years, were later documented as questionable, although the very fact of fierce resistance and the division's destruction almost in its entirety is not in doubt. General Panfilov himself was killed by a shell fragment literally a few days after that battle, on the 18th of November 1941, never learning that the division would soon be given his name. According to the recollections of surviving soldiers, during the first weeks of the defense of Moscow, the division, due to personnel losses, effectively ceased to exist as a combat unit several times, and was reassembled from reinforcements, rear units, and even reservists who happened to be nearby. German tank commanders noted in their reports unexpectedly stubborn resistance precisely in this sector, although they were formally opposed by poorly armed and almost untrained rifle units hastily deployed just in front of Moscow. For its steadfastness near Moscow, the formation received the Guards title and a new number, but the price of this title was measured by an almost complete turnover of personnel within just a few weeks of the most grueling defense. The 9th Field Army of the Wehrmacht, tasked with holding the Rzhev salient, became a party to a battle that German soldiers themselves, in letters home, referred to as nothing other than a meat grinder, and which Soviet historians decades later, without a hint of irony, called the Rzhev meat grinder. It is formally considered that it was here, and not at Stalingrad, that the Wehrmacht suffered some of its heaviest cumulative personnel losses on a single sector of the front over the course of almost a year and a half of continuous fighting for a patch of land that held no strategic value after the failure of the German offensive on Moscow. A little-known fact: the Soviet command repeatedly conducted major offensive operations here precisely to tie down this army and prevent its reserves from being transferred to Stalingrad, and the price of this pinning strategy for both sides remains a subject of fierce debate among historians to this day, as the final loss figures long remained classified archival material. Unlike the previous entry on this list, this is not about the defeat of a single division in a matter of days, but about the slow, multi-month grinding down of an entire army, which several times changed the composition of its constituent divisions. The German defense in the Rzhev salient was built on a dense system of bunkers and minefields, which made every Soviet attack extremely costly, but did not save the Ninth Army itself from the exhaustion of its reserves. In March 1943, the German command itself made the decision to abandon the Rzhev salient, acknowledging that further holding of this sector made no sense given the losses already sustained by both sides. The 138th Rifle Division, under Colonel Lyudnikov, defended in Stalingrad on a narrow strip of the Volga bank, with an area of less than 1 square kilometer, which subsequently became known as Lyudnikov's Island, having been completely cut off from the division's main forces for several weeks in a row. Supplies were delivered only at night across the Volga under continuous enemy fire. Ammunition and food were dropped from aircraft onto the small bridgehead, and part of the cargo inevitably fell into territory occupied by German units. A non-obvious detail: despite near-total encirclement, acute water shortages, and constant attacks, the garrison of the island was never dislodged by German forces throughout the entire defense, and Colonel Lyudnikov himself later admitted that he daily expected a report of the complete annihilation of the remnants of his division. The wounded on the bridgehead could not be evacuated to the other bank for months, and medics had to operate right in the bunkers by the light of makeshift oil lamps under unceasing artillery fire, while the severely wounded often waited for their turn to cross the night river for weeks. At a certain point, German staff maps ceased to mark the bridgehead altogether as a separate pocket of resistance, considering it de facto destroyed, which did not prevent the garrison from continuing its defense. According to the recollections of survivors, by the time of linking up with the main forces of the Red Army, only a few hundred men were holding out on this tiny bridgehead, whereas the division had begun the defense of Stalingrad with a full, authorized strength of several thousand soldiers. For this episode, the division received the Guards designation, and the name Lyudnikov's Island itself entered military history as a symbol of defense where personnel losses were almost equal to the number of the original defenders. The 1st Parachute Division of the Wehrmacht, dubbed the Green Devils by the enemy since the Crete airborne operation, defended the monastery and the heights of Monte Cassino in Italy for several months against superior Allied forces, including American, British, Polish, New Zealand, and French colonial units. The German paratroopers had entrenched themselves so thoroughly in the rocky terrain that artillery and aerial strikes against the monastery, including the near-total destruction of the building itself by massive bombardment, failed to force the garrison to retreat. Allied casualties during the assaults on the position are considered among the highest of the entire Italian campaign. A little-known fact: the paratroopers themselves claimed after the war that prior to the devastating bombing of the monastery, they had deliberately refrained from using its walls as firing positions, a version confirmed by some modern historians, which does not negate the colossal Allied losses during subsequent assaults on the already completely destroyed ruins. The defenders utilized every cave and every crevice in the rock as a separate firing point, and dislodging the paratroopers from a single such position sometimes cost the Allies an entire day of fighting and dozens of men killed and wounded. New Zealand and Indian units that stormed the town of Cassino at the foot of the heights later described the street fighting there as arguably the most brutal of the entire Italian campaign, comparable in intensity of fire to major urban battles on other war fronts. The division held its position until May 1944, when it was forced to retreat after Polish units captured the key height at the cost of enormous casualties of their own. By the time of the withdrawal, only a portion of the original mountain defenders remained in the ranks. The rest had been killed, wounded, or taken prisoner during the long months of defending that single height. The 502nd Heavy Tank Battalion of the Wehrmacht, armed with Tiger tanks, operated on the Leningrad direction and was one of the first units where the German command tested the new heavy machines in massed attacks against dense Soviet defenses. It was in the ranks of this battalion that Kurt Knispel served, a driver-mechanic and later a gunner, to whom after the war was attributed the highest confirmed number of destroyed enemy tanks among all Wehrmacht tankers, although the exact figure is still disputed by historians due to the incompleteness of German wartime award documents. A non-obvious detail: during its first combat deployment near Leningrad, the battalion operated in swampy terrain, extremely unsuitable for heavy machines, and lost several tanks not to enemy fire, but due to breakdowns and becoming stuck in the sodden ground, which forced the command to temporarily reconsider the very tactics for employing the new equipment. The armor of the new machines indeed proved almost invulnerable to the main Soviet anti-tank guns of that period, which gave rise to a special, almost superstitious fear of these tanks among the infantry of both sides, and reports of their appearance on a sector of the front often caused panic even before the first shot. The battalion's crews, meanwhile, had to fight under conditions of constant spare parts shortages, and a significant portion of the machines stood idle for months under repair, awaiting parts transported hundreds of kilometers from factories in Germany. Nevertheless, as combat experience accumulated, the battalion became one of the most effective tank units of the Wehrmacht in terms of the ratio of its own losses to destroyed enemy equipment. Kurt Knispel was killed in April 1945, mere days before the end of the war, never having received official documentary confirmation of his record during his lifetime. The Marine Infantry of Stalingrad, whom German soldiers in their letters and reports called the Black Death due to their distinctive dark peacoats, was formed from brigades transferred to the city from the Pacific Fleet and the Caspian Flotilla. From the very first battles in the city's streets, they earned a reputation among the enemy as troops who would engage in hand-to-hand combat without the slightest hesitation. It was these brigades that held the most dangerous sectors in the area of the Red October plant and Mamayev Kurgan, where the front line at times ran literally through the same factory workshop or floor of a residential building. A little-known detail: the sailors themselves categorically refused to remove their naval uniforms even during protracted ground battles, although this made them more conspicuous targets for German snipers. It was precisely this detail, according to testimonies of captured German soldiers, that gave rise to the legend of a certain elite suicide unit that instilled greater fear than ordinary infantry. German commanders in their reports separately noted that the sailors were extremely reluctant to surrender even in hopeless situations, preferring to fight to the last bullet in a basement or on a stairwell. The losses of the naval rifle brigades at Stalingrad were among the highest of all the formations defending the city, as they were regularly thrown into counterattacks precisely where the defense threatened to collapse within hours. By February of the year 1943, when the 6th Army of the Wehrmacht capitulated at Stalingrad, only isolated groups of fighters remained in the ranks from the original composition of most of these brigades, and the brigades themselves were repeatedly replenished anew directly during the months-long battle. The 5th SS Panzer Division Viking, formed from German volunteers and volunteers from Scandinavian and Dutch units, operated on the southern sector of the Eastern Front, and later found itself among the formations encircled in the Korsun-Shevchenkovsky pocket in the winter of 1944. During the attempt to break out of the encirclement, the division lost almost all of its heavy equipment and artillery, and a portion of its personnel perished even after escaping the ring, while attempting to cross a river swollen by the spring thaw under heavy fire from pursuing Soviet units. A non-obvious fact: it was the remnants of this division that later formed the core of a newly formed separate unit, staffed primarily by Belgian and other Western European volunteers, making Viking arguably the most international in composition among all SS formations on the entire Eastern Front. Many veterans of the division, who emerged from the Korsun pocket practically without weapons or equipment, later recalled this breakout as a more terrifying experience than any single battle throughout their service. Despite the catastrophic losses at Korsun, the division was repeatedly rebuilt and thrown back into battle up until the final months of the war, including in heavy fighting in Hungary and later in Pomerania. By Germany's surrender, practically none of the division's original volunteer corps remained in the ranks. Most had been killed, captured, or transferred to other units after numerous reorganizations. This was the first part about the most lethal units of the Second World War. If you liked the video, be sure to write about it in the comments, and I will definitely publish the continuation. See you soon!